Well, I would like to thank the foundation for this. And I think we need to have slightly less chatty interviewers in future. Now, Sylvie BERMANN, I'm not going to reply to everything that's been said, but how do you see the scenario with China and China's strategies, and what reaction should we have, in your opinion, vis-a-vis this strategy and this development or evolution by China? Once again, thank you for being with us. Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. Brilliant intervention by the former Prime Minister, talking not only about these dizzying changes, but also Tolstoy and all of the great thinkers of geopolitics of our days. It's a very difficult act to follow, actually. Now, if we can see very clearly that the Thucydides trap is on display here, and I think there's a certain paranoia. Just a few weeks ago, if you look at the cover of The Economist, it was Joe Biden in his sunglasses, the Chinese wrapped up in the Chinese flag. And there's a bit of an obsession there that China is going to become the new single superpower. And there is a clear hubris that was not the case before. Deng Xiaoping said that we needed to hide behind this, but Xi Jinping came out of the shadows very quickly. And the treatment of the Uyghurs, of course, has caused a lot of hostility worldwide. There's a lot of criticism in Europe, and China really is scaring a lot of people. The Cold War. Well, I think this is a real Cold War playing out right now. I mean, it's not the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union back in the day and the end of the Soviet Union. It's a different kind of Cold War. Military, nuclear, and ideological was the previous one, but this is a multifaceted Cold War right now. As Kishore Kubamani said, this started off with a war of tariffs, a tariff war between the States and China, and Chinese exports to the States were higher than before, and Trump was very worried about that. And there's something a lot more essential in the technological war, and there's a real blockage or blockade by the US vis-a-vis China, semiconductors, Huawei. All of the companies are banned from trading with Huawei. Not only US companies, the European companies are also. The UK had to do a U-turn on their dealings with Huawei, and the companies, the tech companies in China are causing a lot of discomfort. Pascal BONIFACE will tell us a few things about Taiwan. I think a lot of oil has been poured onto the fire, and that's quite dangerous. If we look at China's actions in the region, but we have had this sort of ideological war of democracy versus communism, and now Joe Biden wants to forge this great alliance of democracy. Well, good luck with that, Mr. Biden, because it's not an easy thing to do. You can't really decide exactly what democracy is to everybody, and China should not become a democracy. It has its traditions, so we read. It's a country that could open up a lot more, and but there's been a real toughening of the regime, a hardening. So we're not talking about a democracy. What does China think about this? Well, can we have a peaceful coexistence between different regimes? The US is obsessed with regime change. We've seen that in the way things are going in Afghanistan, that whole dream is crumbling, and the rest of the world can perfectly well coexist with different systems. Kishore Bhumani also talked about the humiliation, the center of humiliation of China, and that's very important for them. And the reason why they have reacted so violently to the European sanctions is because they consider that as the top world power in terms of purchasing power parity, and by the end of the decades, but they don't accept that other countries should meddle in their affairs. And I think China is quite ready and quite prepared to cooperate with the US, even if they're not asking for that. And there's a certain the speech by Xi Jinping in Davos 2015, I think, at the election of up to the election of Joe Biden, he reaffirmed his will to have a policy of openness, and very much talked up the benefits of free trade. Now, China is isolated. We see democracies on the one hand and the Chinese autocracy on the other hand, but they have got very close to Russia, for example. Based on the principle of my friends are my friends, there's special cooperation, aeronautics and so on between these countries that had not happened before because there was a certain amount of mistrust. China is a lot more popular than the US within Asia, also within the Balkans, because of the question of the Sinopharm vaccine. And this is seen to be generosity, the generosity in inverted commas. It wasn't really generosity, but there was a sort of tacit understanding that providing vaccines was not necessarily completely a favor, but China is popular in the Balkans. They're not completely isolated. They will continue with their new Silk Road, or the this approach that they are rolling out. Now, up till now, the EU has been seen by China as more or less independent from the US. There's always been an alliance vis-a-vis their shared enemies, US and the Soviet Union, and the sympathy with the Europeans. But we'll be hearing later on that this is quite absurd because of this agreement on investments that was signed at the end of last year. This is certainly an agreement that was signed on the request of the European Commission to obtain a number of concessions and market opening from the Chinese for certain sectors such as health, cars, telecommunications. It was also the end of the demands in terms of technology transfer, and also an obligation to for the companies to join joint ventures with Europe. So the United States have asked the Europeans not to sign these agreements and to wait for Biden to take up his post, and then they pretext somewhat on the initiative of the US, because of the current situation, to adopt sanctions, something which had not been done since 1989. So they are applying sanctions to all players, including the European Parliament and the EU, who are responsible for ratifying this agreement. But we considered this has been put on ice, and that the Chinese This was not a present and not a gift to the Chinese. This was concessions that the Chinese were prepared to make, not perfect indeed, could have been improved upon, but it was certainly in Europe's interest and on the request of Europe. Therefore, that's the situation we're in. It's quite absurd, particularly because the Americans in phase one of the agreement managed to get those conditions. So, and then they're asking us not to sign the same conditions that they just had.
Soit indépendante. On a parlé beaucoup quand on a défini.
It's absolutely essential for the European Union to stay independent. We talked about the strategic importance of a partnership, but we also said that it was the end of the European Union's naivete towards China. But I think it also, that's maybe true, but we also need to establish the end of naivete towards the United States. So we need to have normalized relations with China and find a proper area, just like we did with Russia and other countries that were quite adversarial. So, you know, we often see, for instance, the United States, when they make decisions, they're unilateral. They decide to withdraw troops from Syria or elsewhere. They do so without consulting anyone. So we need to keep our best interests in mind in our relationship with the United States. And we need to have a powerful European Union, and Europeans the former prime minister earlier talked about sleepwalking, and we need to wake up and not focus too much on our preconceived notions about the United States. It's important that we define ourselves and know our place in this between these two superpowers. Thank you very much, Ms. Berman. So Pascal Boniface would say that your opinion was very similar in the vein of de Gaulle Mitterrand. But Pascal, how can we avoid Bismarck's trap? In that when you have a three-sided conflict, you need to be one of the two most powerful. How would you deal with that? She said many interesting things indeed, but there is a main question, and that is the European Union a major power? No one doubts that the United States is one, that China is one. But is Europe a power? Well, we're divided. We don't have, we're divided by history and our relationship faced with Russia and the United States. And so the interest here is that we don't want to blindly follow behind. And so indeed it's important to stop, to avoid shortcuts. It's, you know, we don't, again, blindly have to follow whatever the United States does faced with China. Because when we say, for instance, China, we have to be careful because they're an authoritarian regime, etc. Well, keep in mind that China is not a democracy. To paraphrase a famous quote, when the strategist talks about human rights, well, the imbecile just sees the finger that's pointing to the rights. We can't blindly follow a policy that isn't ours. We need to let our interests be our guiding light For instance, we saw that China sanctions BNP with 9 billion euro in fines. And so we need to keep that in mind in defending our rights. Mr. Vedrin, there's worse than realpolitik, and that's irrealpolitik. Obviously, there was a sort of illusion for a while. People hoped that China would become a democracy. But no, the Chinese maybe adjusted their way of doing things, but they have not become Western by any means. And for 5 decades, we had a Cold War, which is still in people's minds. And if we still think that the world is a world that's dominated by Western powers, we are heading straight into a wall. We're going to go from illusions into disillusionment. And I think that the majority of Chinese prefer to live in the China of today than the China 40 years ago. As Kishore said, if you're in China today and you adhere to the regime, it's not because you've read the texts and the doctrine and all. It's because, well, the country works. We talked a lot about totalitarian system for China. But let's look at the Taliban, for instance. Taliban dictates what music you can listen to. In China, it's not a democracy, but it's not as strict as something like a regime like the Taliban either. You can listen to the music you want, you can dress however you want. And it's not because China doesn't follow a Western system that we can't cooperate with them. And look at what's going on in Afghanistan. It's not because we intervened there that we were able to change anything. So it's illusory to think that we could do the same thing in China. There were 150 million Chinese that left before COVID, that left their country, but they go back. It's not that they were leaving and fleeing the country. So it's important that we've been talking about naivete, and it's also naive to avoid any sort of contact whatsoever because they're different. French GDP was 4 times higher than Chinese GDP, but today that's reversed. So maybe people are surprised or admire that fact, but it doesn't bring about an existential angst, if you will. Why? Well, for instance, keep in mind that the vast majority of Americans, at least those who are under the age of 90, have always lived in a world where the United States has been the #1 power. And it doesn't matter whether the president of the United States is Obama or Trump, but what rules there is a bipartisan, a two-sided consensus. China, yes, is officially a communist country. But again, the overriding idea right now in the Communist Party is not the basis of the communist tests, but is powering the economy. So when China joined the WTO in 2001, their GDP was 10% less than the United States, but now it's caught up and passed it. But we've seen, so for instance, Alison talked about 16 situations in which power, an ascending power, caught up with the power, the world power. There, and all but 4 of those cases, that confrontation led to war. There were 4 situations in which it didn't lead to war. So one in the early 20th century between the United Kingdom and the United States, in the 70s and 80s, we also saw the Cold War between the United States, USSR and the United States, and Kissinger and others were there in power to kind of deal with that situation. We also see that having, for instance, today, a very powerful China with so many Chinese is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we remain true to our point of view and our values. If, for instance, we look at the situation in Afghanistan, if Western powers continue to say it's only upon us to deal with the issue, we actually, it would be much smarter to say we need to work with the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians to find a solution to this problem. And when the habit has been, in terms of strategy, to kind of have to dictate the way all sides should deal with an adversary, but in fact that is a poor reflex to have, and it doesn't work. We need to work with our neighbors, with other people with whom we don't necessarily share everything, but we do share some common interests. So in this world, only multilateral solutions are going to work. So the problem when we're talking about morals is that we each all have our morals, but others have morals too. If we continue to dictate what we're supposed to do, what others are supposed to do to others, we're not going to get anywhere. It's not effective or efficient. Now, for instance, in the situation of Taiwan, Taiwan is in a very precarious situation. And Taiwan has realized that people are not necessarily, or other powers are not necessarily going to come and help them out. They've seen that if no one could help Afghanistan, that other powers in the world are probably not going to come and help save them from the Chinese. And so we need it's important to also think of dignity and saving face. You know, some people say that the Russians, the Chinese, they don't care about that, but that's wrong. It's important to respect others, to allow them to save face, because not just our side, but China is also tempted by hubris. So, for instance, you know, we're talking about in this age of COVID, it's premature to say that we've defeated the COVID, and to forget that we have many more trading partners in China than we do in the United States. So, for instance, yes, there is an axis of more authoritarian regime, but careful, a lot of countries such as North Korea have said that they wouldn't necessarily follow us in that type of confrontation. If Americans want to force other countries to choose sides between the United States and China, a lot of countries are not going to side with the US and they'll choose China for different reasons. So they need to be very careful because they have things that they need to work on. The United States needs to work on its infrastructure, on dealing with a lot of internal problems, because people have realized that the United States is not necessarily an example to follow in every case. And we really need to work together to be able to meet the challenges that our society faces today. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Recently, I spoke with Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. Is a member of Leaders for Peace. And Mr. Blinken admitted that China has actually become a guiding point or a very important point in domestic policy in the United States. Prime Minister, we quoted Kissinger earlier. Who said that not necessarily, we fear a Russia-China alliance or a Soviet-China alliance, but we see that today China has the second largest army in the world. Which is formidable indeed. And the United States, if it's smart, will realize that, that the two of them combined have the most powerful armies, and that needs to be taken into account. Before we started talking, I thought that we weren't far from achieving a miracle at Poitiers. What do I mean by that? Well, because we're almost in agreement. And it's great to see that. It's great to see that we might be in agreement. And the other thing that is pretty neat is that the 3 or 4 of us have the advantage of thinking geographically. Basically, you think in the way once you come. And Europe still pictures itself as being geographically very far from China. And geographically, it's been quite convenient for us to think that way. But I like to speak with people who think geographically closer to China. There are those that geographically align themselves more with the United States. Now, the Vietnamese know that they have a formidable neighbor, and the Vietnamese can't move their country. So they must think about the power that's across the East Sea, as the Sea of China is called in Vietnam. They're not necessarily pro-China, but they know that they're wary of a confrontation with China, with this geographically close neighbor. So it's a complicated situation, but that is dictated, their position is dictated by geography, but also in this, they want to find allies, not necessarily military allies, but maybe a partner. It's easier for us to say that it could work easily, that things will be fine, than somebody who finds them, who shares a border with or is in close proximity to their neighbor. I'd like to maybe share with others an anecdote about something that happened to the two of us.
I was lucky enough to welcome Dmitry Medvedev, who at the time was Prime Minister, and I was happy to welcome him, and therefore I asked him to come to Le Havre, and he was quite touched by this gesture because he quickly understood that Le Havre was the most beautiful town in France. And he came over and we had the classic diplomatic segments with a meeting and a press conference. And in the evening, I decided to bring him to an excellent restaurant in Le Havre so that he can enjoy French food. And we have an excellent discussion, and we're talking about China without the ambassadors of China and Russia and France, because at the time we wanted to have a private conversation. I'm not going to reveal everything from this private conversation, but of course we started to talk about China in general, but also the relationship between Russia and China. And without any caricature, but I want to go quite fast here. Medvedev says, well, what should Russia say? Russia is saying that China is not a friend, that China is not a natural ally, and that one day China will probably be dangerous. But today, and for quite a long time to come, the Russians at least understand China. And now they no longer understand it. We were talking about the importance of relationship, of understanding, and I think that's an incredible explanation. The Russians are saying, we know exactly what they want, we understand what they want, and we prefer to understand and have a dialogue partner that we can understand compared to other dialogue partners that we do not understand. So that is directly linked to everything that we've been thinking about. So we have nothing to win if we do not get understood by Russia. Thank you very much. It means, in other words, that overall we are the actors of the closeness between Russia and China. Thank you very much to Pascal Boniface and to Sylvie BERMANN for their participation in our meeting today.